Welcome to this video on rounding rules. After watching this video, you will be able to state the general rounding rule, apply the rounding rules using decimal place terminology, and apply rounding rules using place value terminology. The basic rounding rule is as follows. If the number you are rounding is followed by a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8, or a 9, you will change the number, which means you're rounding up. If the number you are rounding is followed by a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4, you will keep the number, which is referred to as rounding down. A helpful memory hint is to remember 5 and above, give it a shove. Rounding vocabulary, decimal places. Some problems will ask you to round to 2 decimal places or 4 decimal places. This tells you the number of digits that should appear to the right of the decimal point after you are done rounding. So if the problem asks you to round to 1 decimal place, that means that you're going to have only 1 digit to the right of the decimal point. If the problem asks you to round to 2 decimal places, that means you are going to have 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. If the problem asks you to round to 3 decimal places, you would have 3 digits after the decimal point. And if it asks you to round to 4 decimal places, that would mean that you would have 4 digits to the right of the decimal point. Other problems will ask you to round to the nearest tenth or the nearest 100th or the nearest 1000th. To understand this better, let's review place values. Let's use this number as an example. Where is the 10th place? If you said 6, that is correct. Where is the 100th place? That's the 8. Then we have the thousandth place, followed by the 10,000th place, and lastly the 100,000th place. So if we're asked to round to the nearest tenth, that means that we only want 1 digit to the right of the decimal point. Rounding to the nearest hundredth means that we want 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. Rounding to the nearest thousandth means we want 3 digits to the right of the decimal point. And rounding to the nearest 10,000th would be 4 digits to the right of the decimal point. Example 1, rounding to 1 decimal place. Round the number 5.62398 to 1 decimal place. To do this, we are going to be cutting the number right here. And the only number we care about to make this decision is the number to the right of that line, which is a 2. So in this answer, the only 2 possible valid answers are a 5.6 or 5.7. If the number after the 6 is a 4 or lower, then we are rounding to 5.6. In other words, we keep the 6, we don't change it. If the number after the 6 is 5 or higher, we would round the 6 up to a 7. So as you can see here, the number after the 6 is a 2, which is lower than 4, or lower than 5 rather, so we would keep this at 5.6. Notice that we completely ignore the 3, the 9, and the 8. They don't matter to us. The only digit that we are looking at to make this decision is the 2, the number right next to the 6. So 5.62398 rounded to 1 decimal place is 5.6. Notice that rounding to 1 decimal place is equivalent to rounding to the nearest tenth. Example 2, rounding to 2 decimal places. Round the number 5.62398 to 2 decimal places. That means that we divide the number here, and the only number that is going to determine how we round is the digit 3. So in this case, our only 2 possible outcomes are either 5.62, which means we keep the 2, or 5.63, which means we would round the 2 up to a 3. If the number after 2 is a 4 or lower, we would keep the number as 5.62. If the number after the 2 is 5 or higher, we would round up to 5.63. As you can see here, the number directly next to the 2 to the right is a 3. So since 3 is below a 5, we would keep the number 5.62. Therefore, 5.62398 rounded to 2 decimal places is 5.62. Notice that rounding to 2 decimal places is the same as rounding to the nearest 100th. Example 3, rounding to 3 decimal places. Round the number 5.62398 to 3 decimal places. We're going to divide the number here, and the only digit that is going to determine our decision is the number 9. So the only 2 possible answers are either 5.623 or 5.624. If the number after the 3 is 4 or lower, we will keep the number as 5.623. If the number after the 3 is 5 or higher, we would round the number up to 5.624. As you can see above, the number after the 3 is a 9, so we round up to 5.624. Therefore, the number 5.62398 rounded to 3 decimal places is 5.624. Notice that rounding to 3 decimal places is the same as rounding to the nearest 1,000th. Example 4, rounding to 4 decimal places. Round the number 5.62398 to 4 decimal places. Here, we are going to cut the number between 9 and 8. Notice the number 8 is what is going to determine our outcome. So the only two possible answers are either 5.6239, meaning we keep what's there, or 5.6340, where we round up to the next value. If the number after the 9 is 4 or lower, we would keep the number 5.6239. If the number after the 9 is 5 or higher, then we would round up to 5.6240. As you can see here, the number after the 9 is an 8, so we are rounding up to 5.6240. Therefore, 5.62398 rounded to 4 decimal places is 5.6240. Note that rounding to 4 decimal places is the same as rounding to the nearest 10,000th. Let's practice rounding this number using place value vocabulary. Let's round to the nearest tenth. Pause the video and see if you can get this correct. If you said 5.7, then you got that right. Can you round to the nearest hundredth? Again, pause the video, write down your answer, and then unpause it to see if you are correct. So the number after the 8 is a 7, so we're going to round up to 5.69. How about rounding to the nearest thousandth? What is the answer there? The answer is 5.687. Lastly, if we want to round to the nearest 10,000th, we get 5.6872. Notice the number next to a 1 is a 5, so we round it up to 2. Common mistake in rounding. Suppose you are asked to round the number 6.447 to the nearest tenth. Some students will begin by rounding 6.447 to 6.45. They will then round 6.45 to 6.5. Is this a correct approach? Pause the video, write down your answer, and then unpause it to see if you are correct. So let's look again at the number 6.47. If we were rounding to the nearest tenth, this is where we're going to cut the number. So the only number we need to concern ourselves with is the 4 that is right next to the first 4. Since we have a 4, right, which is lower than a 5, that means we keep the value. So we are going to be rounding this to 6.4. Remember, you only look at that digit that's directly next to the number you're rounding to. You don't look at any of the numbers. You completely ignore all of the other digits in the problem. So rounding 6.447 to 6.5 is not correct. Having watched this video, you should now be able to state the general rounding rule, apply the rounding rule using decimal place terminology, and apply the rounding rule using place value terminology.